It was a real roller coaster ride over the weekend as Formula One returned to Saudi Arabia for the second time, but it wasn't without controversy off track. On track, we were treated to what turned out to be quite the cracker of a race with a epic battle between Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc for the race win, the world champion winning out. We'll, of course, be discussing all of that and much, much more. The recording date is Monday, the 28th of March. My name is Harry Benjamin. Alongside me, Crash F1 editor Lewis Larkham, F1 commentator for the likes of the BBC and Channel 4, Ben Edwards is here too. Lovely to see you both again, gents. Ben, first of all, your overall reflections of a pretty good race in Saudi Arabia, round two, and F1 in 2022 seems to be delivering.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I thought it was a fantastic race, and that battle between Leclerc and Verstappen was awesome. And the fact that, they could actually congratulate each other afterwards, even Leclerc could congratulate Max, that was proper racing. And it was just lovely to see. I love to see the way they both were trying to operate, both trying to be clever. It was really genuine racing between those two for a race victory. And, we don't often see it quite like that and getting through it without damage. So, yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. There were some good points, some less good points, obviously, but that battle for the lead for me was just fantastic.
Absolutely. And Lewis, as well, from your perspective, I mean, forget the battle at the front as well. It was an incredibly tight midfield, lots of reliability issues creeping in too for multiple teams. It was a race of attrition, which we thought we kind of got away with in Bahrain, but here it sprung its head.
Yeah, a few teams having some issues for the first time. We saw a glimpse of it in pre-season testing, but like you say, in Bahrain during the race, most teams ran smoothly, but finally getting some issues, race-ending issues for Ricciardo and Alonso and Yuki Tsunoda not even starting the race due to the power unit issues that AlphaTauri are having, which seem to be quite a concern. But as Ben said, yeah, a really fantastic race again. Great fight between Max and Charles for the leads, and really interesting to see how that played out with the sort of DRS chicken into the final corner onto the main straight. Yeah, really, really great battle, and it sets things up really nicely for the next few races.
It certainly does, and we'll come on to that. But first, actually, Ben, I'll come back to you on this. A huge talking point over the weekend, of course, was the attack that occurred just miles away from the circuit at the Aramco oil distribution centre, I believe it was. And that sprung all types of questions and conversations. And I suppose the overarching one was, should Formula One now return to Saudi Arabia for two different reasons, I suppose. The off-track excursions, but also the safety of the track as well. We saw that huge incident for Mick Schumacher in turn 12. Lots of other cars having nearly moments too. So I suppose now is in these following days that are occurring after the Grand Prix is when F1 bosses will be sitting down to go, right, okay, how do we go forward from here? Because Saudi Arabia has a long-term deal.
It does have a very long-term deal. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Sort of combination of things going on. And clearly the drivers were pretty upset about that missile that landed not far away and caused a bit of trouble. I think obviously that is part of what's going on in Saudi. And there's big arguments, pro and against whether you go to a country like that to amplify what is going on in that country and help the rest of the world try and correct that, or do you not go to that country at all and just ignore them entirely? It's a difficult balance. I think that's a difficult balancing act. Formula One, of course, gets a lot of money by racing in Saudi, so that has a part to play. But they did some positive things too, like Asid Al Hamad and Abi Pulling driving Formula One cars in other parts of the country. Women drivers driving Formula One cars, doing a display in other parts of the country. That was fabulous, and you've got to think, well, that's got to be a positive. So there are positives and negatives. Of course, it needs thinking about. The track itself, as you say, that still worries me. I have to say, watching the weekend. Thankfully, the race was clean, but there were moments when I was watching practice and qualifying. It really kind of shocks me a little bit, worries me, seeing the speeds they're doing. Street tracks traditionally tend to be slower, understandably, because they're street tracks. So I do have a bit of a question over this one. I'm a bit disappointed that the track at Qiddiya, which they were talking about building up for next year, isn't actually ready yet, and that they could sort of shift to a different track. So we'll just have to see.
Yeah, and Lewis as well. It was a big impact for Mick Schumacher. I think he said himself 20 years ago he wouldn't have been walking away from that most likely. So a great example of the advance of the safety of these cars has come, especially with the updated safety measures taken after Romain Grosjean's huge incident in Sakir. But it's not what the drivers want to see. A lot of them were already a bit off edge because of the missile attack. So it's going to be a question that rolls on and on and on, because people weren't happy to be racing in Saudi Arabia overall.
Yeah, I think that I wasn't on the ground myself this weekend, but there was a real sense of unease, I think, throughout the paddock that stemmed from everyone there to the drivers who, we had this extraordinary meeting on the Friday night after the missile attack, and the drivers clearly made it clear that they were not comfortable racing, and at one stage it looked like they were willing to boycott the event. It was only when the team principal sort of stepped in and gave those assurances that security was tightened for the event and that the circuit itself wasn't threatened, that they agreed to continue. But it really cast a shadow, I think, over the weekend as a whole, and then that stemmed to Ontrack with Mick's really scary crash, huge impact, high speed, really worrying place of the circuit as well. I mean, thankfully in a way it happened in qualifying, because if that had happened in the race, how would the drivers have been able to react to that? A blind part of the high-speed blind part of the circuit could have been a lot worse. It doesn't really bear thinking about. But yeah, a tricky one. The drivers have raised the questions about safety at the track. It is a dangerous circuit. We were only talking about this on the last podcast, previewing the weekend, saying how worried we were last year, and it just gives you a sense that something bad is going to happen. There's that real feeling that you're not too far away from a big accident occurring, and that is a big worry. Like I said, the drivers will be talking about this with F1 going forwards, so we'll see where that goes, but it's sure going to be a topic that will rumble on.
Yeah, I mean, the drivers also got a buzz out of it too, though, didn't they? I mean, several of them were saying, wow, this is astonishing track to drive. And you could see at the end of the race, just how much Verstappen and Leclerc had put into racing at that level on a track that fast. So it's a real mix of good and bad. It does frighten me a bit, but it also clearly, it worries the drivers, but it also fulfills them.
Somebody asked me over the weekend, especially with the Drive to Survive generation influx of fans, do people watch F1 because they want to see a crash? They want to see the crashes. And I had to think about my answer to that question, because especially racing around Saudi, so difficult to sort of gauge it. But I think at the end of the day, it's down to people watch Formula One, and I suppose the racers race in Formula One because they want that sense, they want that adrenaline kick, but also it's that idea of jeopardy, isn't it? But it's a fine balance. You can, there might be a crash, but you can't be trying to almost enforce a crash like almost the track kind of entails you to do. There were so many, especially I think it was turn 12 where Schumacher went off. I think we saw both Alpines and perhaps even one of the Ferraris have almost the exact same incident. They were just able to catch the car in time. But it really begs the question, we want exciting, entertaining races. We want tracks that enable that to happen. But we can't start pushing for more and more things like crashes to happen, can we? It's about finding that right balance. I don't know, is jeopardy the right word, Ben? Is that sort of where we want to aim at? It's trying to have it there, but also, we want good, clean, safe racing.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's always jeopardy in motor racing. Doesn't matter what it is. Motor racing is dangerous, as we know. I mean, the F1 cars are remarkable now in terms of how they hold up to impacts and stuff, but people can still get hurt. And yeah, it's always a balance. It's always a balance to having great tracks that are really fulfilling for the drivers, and they really know they've got to go to the edge of what they can do, and this is one of them. But it still worries me a bit with the lack of visibility in places, and it's not just the nature of the corners, but it's sometimes not knowing what's quite beyond you, and not being able to see it and coming up on it so quickly. That I hope they can just open it up from that point of view, so that they can see a bit more.
Well, absolutely. Well, we'll leave that one there for a minute. I think we can talk about that for many hours. But let's actually talk about the on-track action as well, because one thing it did produce was some exceptional racing, Lewis. Verstappen versus Leclerc, it turned out to be after... Well, we had a safety car, we had tyre strategy, pit stop strategy. Unfortunately for Sergio Perez, a first-time pole position, which I think everybody had a smile on their face for. He... bit unlucky in the end with the calling of his pit lane, but he was kind of tricked into it, wasn't he, by the Ferrari team? It was a great battle. Can we sustain this kind of thing all season long? And actually, crucially, it was fairly good, clean racing, which we haven't always seen from Max Verstappen, especially last year.
Yeah, you really have to feel for Sergio Perez. He was really unfortunate with the timing of the safety car a lap after he pitted. That really ruined his chances of fighting for the win. But it obviously then set up what was to come with Max and Charles fighting for the win. And as we touched on, that was a really exciting battle. It was clean. How long that will last remains to be seen. I still feel there will be some fireworks down the road with that. I cannot see them racing this hard for the entire season and not have some kind of incident. We saw it last year with Lewis and Max. At some point, you feel that might come to a head, but they've raced very cleanly the first two races, and it's been brilliant to watch. Hopefully, it can continue. It looks like they are already sort of pulling away in the sort of fight for the title for this year. So long may it continue.
And there was talk, wasn't there, Ben, and Lewis actually alluded to it earlier, about whether we would need DRS in this new era of Formula One. And I think at the moment, we certainly do need DRS, because although they could clearly battle, they could get in front, they could repass each other. Charles Leclerc coming out and saying, well, without DRS, I don't think that would have really been possible. But the question is, especially in Saudi Arabia, does DRS and that fight for the DRS line, is that a nice bit of added strategy, or was it a little bit silly?
It feels a bit weird when they're battling not to be the first one over the DRS line. But it was quite interesting as well, because they both worked out what they were trying to do. DRS is a part of Formula One still at the moment, and I do understand Charles Leclerc's point that I think without that you wouldn't actually get much overtaking. But what these new cars are definitely giving us some encouragement, I think. We weren't quite sure after Bahrain, but now that we've seen Saudi as well and heard from the drivers, I think that they can definitely follow each other more closely than they could before, without the tyres going off quite as quickly. If you tried to follow another car before, your tyres would go terribly. Now they seem to be able to sit there and actually keep the race going, which is nice. And I think DRS is still a part of it. It's just that obviously tactically, everybody's now going to be really studying before they go to each track. They're going to remind themselves, okay, where's the DRS line? Where's the opportunity to get past? But isn't that fun that, we've got a bit of this now, a bit of overtaking, because for so long in Formula One, that's been very difficult.
Yeah, I think it just is an added entertainment, isn't it? I mean, it was borderline silly, but there was no incident at the end of the day. It was clean, but it is a sort of a track-specific issue with Jeddah particularly. We saw it last year with Lewis and Max sort of playing those games, neither one of them wanting to be behind, going onto the main straight to get the DRS boost. And yeah, that I think that is specifically a Jeddah issue with the layout of the track and where the activation zones are. But I think DRS is going to have a big impact this year because, like you've said, the cars can clearly follow easier. And the crucial thing is the drivers are not having to back off. They can remain within half a second to a second for a number of laps and push hard, which is great. That is what F1 intended with these rules. So it's great to see that at a circuit that's more difficult for overtaking compared to Bahrain, that was seeing some results. I think there was something like 38 overtakes actually in the race compared to 18 last year. So there was clearly gains are being made there, and that's great to see. And hopefully this will continue. I think DRS. I like Charles said, I think it helps it in this situation because the cars are following so closely, but they're kind of struggling more this year to pull off those overtakes with a normal slipstream. I think we saw with Lewis following Kevin, he was unable to do that after the safety car restart, I believe it was, and yeah, it was only when he got DRS that he was actually able to make that move stick. So I think it's an important part this season for sure. But I do think the exact games we saw this weekend were specific to Jeddah.
I think, yeah, and also we've got Australia coming up, that Melbourne race. You don't usually get much overtaking. Now, they have changed. I know we'll talk about this more, but they've changed a couple of corners. But it will be interesting to see if the DRS has an effect there, because it hasn't really worked particularly because the straights are fairly short. So I think we'll learn a bit more out of that one too.
Yeah, I was going to say as well, I think I've spoken to a few people over the weekend, I think including Sam Bird, the former Mercedes reserve driver in Formula One, saying as encouraging as these regulations look, he doesn't think it's going to be until really Spain, Barcelona that we get a proper idea of if we've really made an advance, because these first few rounds, completely different racetracks, especially in Bahrain. Bahrain, you can get a fair amount of overtaking anyway, especially when you've got 3 DRS zones. So that's going to be a fascinating one to watch. And I love that stat, Lewis, as well, about the overtaking compared to year on year. That'll be a good one to keep across actually throughout the season. I know there's so many variables with that, but it's a good one to keep in mind. Let's move on to the men in red, particularly the one who didn't do so well, and by that he still came third, Carlos Sainz. Unfortunately, Sainz couldn't quite best his teammate, couldn't quite get involved in that battle for the win. Managed to keep Sergio Perez at bay after that little safety car line incident. But looking at Sainz, I know we're only race 2. I know, and Carlos Sainz, I had him down as my pick to win, so I'm a big backer. But is there a danger here that, like many Ferrari drivers in the past, one is their championship favourite, one is the golden boy, and the other one is relegated to the number 2 driver? And they've been very obvious about that. And if Carlos Sainz feels awful to say get his act together, because it's very much there, but if he can't find that extra bit of pace to challenge for the win and get in front of Leclerc, is he going to be consigned to Ferrari's number 2, especially when he's on the verge of fighting for a new contract, Lewis?
Yeah, I mean, Ferrari have obviously come out before the season and said that both drivers are on equal terms going into the season. But I get the feeling that Sainz already sort of is in that number 2 position. I mean, the first 2 races have been quite evident in the fact that Charles seems to have, at least at this stage, an early pace advantage over Carlos. And we saw in qualifying most times last year, he did have the edge. And I think that's going to be really key this season, is qualifying and setting up the race. And already Charles has, made such a strong start to the season and kind of moved clear in the championship. I think unless Carlos wins in Australia, he's starting to... Ferrari are bound to start looking towards Charles as the guy to challenge for this title fight, especially given how far up the road Charles and Max were. They were in another league compared to the rest of the field. I know Carlos was frustrated by the safety car line issue and he hit out the stewards for being too slow to tell Checo to hand back the position. He felt that if that had happened before the restart, he would have had a chance to potentially mix it up with Max and Charles, and he could have done. But so far, he's just lacking that bit of pace to get up there. He was provisionally on pole position on Saturday at one stage, and then just got pipped by Charles and in the end, and then Perez obviously. But yeah, you do get the sense that unless a big result comes soon, Charles is going to be sort of playing that supporting role, which I think he can do very well. He's a fantastic driver, and I rate him very highly, like yourself. I think he'll do a great job for Ferrari this season, and it will be really crucial, his performance versus Sergio, in terms of the potential outcome of the Constructors' Championship, how they perform against each other. If it is going to be Max versus Charles most of the races for the win, Red Bull and Ferrari need Sergio and Carlos, respectively, to be finishing third or whatever the next highest position is available. And so far, that has been Carlos. So, yeah, he'll be crucial for the Constructors' Championship. But I do think he is ultimately going to end up having to play second fiddle to Charles this season. The way it's gone so far, and it is early days.
Ben, what did you make of that as well? Do you think it's too early to sort of judge Sainz just yet? Because he still hasn't got that first race win, has he?
No, he hasn't yet. I do rate Carlos. I think Charles has got that extra little bit of pace. But what I do think about Carlos is he's got good brain power and he applies himself extremely well. And I just wonder, over the course of a 23 race season, I think he's going to have a very consistent approach all the way through. And I think it's very early days to say, okay, it's all about Charles Leclerc. I think Charles probably does have that tiny bit of extra pace in him. And we saw it, when when he was with Vettel in Ferrari too. It was pretty stunning to see Leclerc's pace at that point. But Carlos has got a good brain, and he works through things. And I think there will be opportunities for him when things come his way, because he'll be just putting his brain in the right place. And I just feel that. But ultimately, I think it's, as you say, I think in a way the team will focus on Leclerc. He's such a Ferrari guy, has been for a while. He's got this massively long contract. And the way he started this season, it's tough for Carlos. But I don't see him being like some years gone by, Ferrari being the second driver has been a bit of a nightmare. I don't actually see that so much. I think Binotto is very fair as a team boss. And I think they will try and keep the two of them together for as long as they can,
Well, we can only hope so, because hopefully will make for better racing. Talking of, the number twos, but hey, Sergio Perez on pole, amazing result, as was incredibly documented over the weekend. Could Ben of Perez won that race if it hadn't have been for the poorly timed pit stop?
I think he probably could have done, yeah. What was interesting about that poorly time, having the first pit stop before Leclerc, what was interesting, watching them go out on the hard compound tyre, they all struggled a bit. So normally you can do what's called the undercut. You put your new set of tyres on, and if you're the first one to do it, your initial lap's going to be mega. So when the other guy comes in and makes a pit stop, they're going to be behind because you've done this mega lap. But actually, that hard tyre, you couldn't really do a mega lap. You're sliding around for the first lap or so before it really starts to come in. So that was interesting to me. But then, of course, we don't know quite what happened there, because that's when the safety car happened. So we couldn't find out whether Leclerc was going to be able to get him anyway at that point. I think Perez drove really well this weekend. I think he's capable of winning races. I thought that lap in qualifying and the way he reacted, the fact that he said 1,000 laps, and that was still the one time he could have done that lap, and he was so fulfilled by it, was wonderful. It's given that will have given him a big boost, I think, to do that in qualifying and to find Max 2 places behind you. That's got to have given him a big boost, and I'm really pleased for him on that.
And ultimately, it was out of his hands. It wasn't that he made a mistake. He was in control of the opening stint, and I agree with Ben. I think he could well have won that race. Everything was pointing towards him being able to keep the pace out front, keep Charles at bay. Obviously, we never found out how that would have gone, but yeah, I think he could be very pleased with his weekend, and that's exactly what Red Bull will be looking to see from him as well. It looks like he's adapted very well to these to the new generation of cars as well. They seem to be suiting his style, and I think that came across in his qualifying lap as well, with Max sort of struggling. He didn't quite have the setup that he really thrives under, where the car's a bit more edgy. And I think Perez sort of got the best out of it in qualifying, whereas that's perhaps why Max struggled. So yeah, a really encouraging weekend for Perez, I think.
He does certainly. I think Christian Horner came out over the weekend and said this car just works so much better for Sergio's skill set as well. So it'll be interesting to see whether he can be up there regularly with the fight as well. Like,